Really great to have people joining in. We will get started in a couple minutes. We'll get started in a minute. Thanks everybody for coming in. Already up to 25 people here, which is fantastic. It's good to see you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Abramson. I am the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. As people are coming in, I'm just going to get us started, and I'm really excited about today's event. The Forum on the Arms Trade actually is turning 10 years old this month, so it's great to be having this week of events. This is the third of five, and there's two more, one each the next day if you'd like to join in. The Forum is a network of civil society experts who work on the implications of the arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use. 10 years ago, we started with 6 people on our website, and today our community is listed experts and emerging experts of about 200 people around the world. And it's great to have people here today to talk about moving the humanitarian disarmament agenda forward in 2025. Uh, Rose is going to talk more about humanitarian disarmament when I turn it over to her, but I just want to make the point that one of the strengths of the humanitarian disarmament movement is its diversity of leaders and partners. There's leaders from the global north who are on this call, but leaders from around the world, including survivors and those who are living in uh, armed conflict areas or suffered from conflict, especially from the weapons that many of us are concerned about, intergovernmental organizations, ICRC, as well as states, especially champion states, are all part of the humanitarian disarmament movement. And many of you are in the audience today. So as part of explaining the technology for the call, the chat will be enabled. Everyone here may use the chat. Please keep it respectful. Most of the people in the audience are in our sort of civil society community. There are a number of diplomats as well, and there are some people just learning about humanitarian disarmament or are skeptics. So please treat each other with respect. There is also a Q&A available. It's going to be impossible for the panelists to actually moderate or respond in the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A. You will be able to see each other's questions in the Q&A. Please upvote the questions that you are most interested in. That will help us when we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. And lastly, there will be a survey that comes up at the end of the webinar. We ask you to please fill that out to give us some feedback on how this went. The Forum on the Arms Trade itself does not take positions, but it provides a platform for others, and we're really delighted to do that today. We've been doing this for a number of years, but I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Rose Bohr, who I don't quite always pronounce your name right. Sorry, Rose, who is the Humanitarian Disarmament Project Lead at PAX. And Rose is having some computer internet technology issues, so she might have to go off video. So really glad you can make this work, and over to you. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, and welcome to all the speakers and the attendees, of course. Welcome to the middle event of a series of 5 events organized by the Forum on Arms Trade. Today we're going to talk about moving the humanitarian disarmament agenda forwards. My name is Rose Bohr and I work with PAX, as Jeff was saying. It's a Dutch peace organization and we work on a range of humanitarian disarmament issues. I will moderate today's event. We have three excellent speakers, if I may say so, which we will first hear from, and then at the back of the event for the last 15 to 20 minutes, we will have room for all your questions, and I'm hopeful that we will have an interactive part of the discussion there. Before I turn to our speakers, I would first like to do a quick introduction from my side, just to make sure that we are all on the same page as to what do we mean with humanitarian disarmament. We mean with humanitarian disarmament, we talk about a people-centered approach to prevent and to remediate human suffering and environmental harm. So it puts the human central to the disarmament initiatives rather than to advance national security. It has had some really important milestones or achievements in the past, to which we count the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017, and the 2022 Political Declaration on Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. These are all important international norms that were set through a humanitarian disarmament approach. And that approach has a couple of characteristics to which Jeff was also referring. But I guess a main feature of a humanitarian disarmament initiative is about the collaboration between civil society and states, UN organizations and international organizations. And as Jeff was saying, in the civil society initiatives, it's often about global coalitions that bring in together very different fields of expertise. So there's legal expertise, technical, humanitarian, people with lived experience, and basically it's this joint force of different expertise within civil society and states and other organizations that drives the issue forward. It's a rather inclusive approach, whether the forum in which the initiative is developed is inside or outside the UN. And 2024 saw some challenges and opportunities too. And I'm very happy to discuss today in what's ahead of us. And we will do so with three experts in the field of humanitarian disarmament: Erin Hunt, Susie Snyder, and Hinawai Lucy, who all work in different areas within the humanitarian disarmament world. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to the experts. And in the first round, I would like to paint a little bit the bigger picture in these different segments of humanitarian disarmament, to see what trends we are witnessing and how that impacts our work, basically. So Erin, if I may start with you. As you think about the current conflicts and how this influences the political landscape in which we all work, what trends do you see in your work, and how do you see this in relation to humanitarian disarmament?
Oh, thanks, Rose. It's a pleasure to be joining you all this morning from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples in Western Canada, where it is still quite dark out in the morning. I will preface my response with saying I am battling a bit of a cough, so I'm going to try and be brief to avoid submitting all of you to listening to me cough. One of, I think, the things that I'd like to talk about the most with this group today is the erosion of norms that we're seeing in current conflicts, particularly in the conduct of the hostilities. I think we see that the most sort of on our phones and on our TV screens with Gaza and Sudan and Ukraine, seeing the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and the use of banned weapons. So images like the widespread bombings of hospitals and civilian infrastructure like houses that we see in particular in Gaza as well as in Sudan and in Ukraine are really shocking. These are things that we thought we had been left in the past. And speaking of things that have been left in the past, we've also seen a pretty high level of use of banned weapons, in particular landmines and cluster munitions, in Ukraine and in Myanmar. And this sort of rise in sort of hostilities and global tensions is having an impact on not just the conduct of hostilities, but also the sort of humanitarian infrastructure, humanitarian disarmament infrastructure. Last year, we saw Lithuania be the first state ever to leave a humanitarian disarmament treaty, leaving the Convention on Cluster Munitions. And right now, following the announcement of US transfer of landmines to anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine, where any use of anti-personnel landmines would put them in violation of the Ottawa Treaty, banning landmines, where Ukraine's been a state party for a number of years. We've seen growing discussion and questioning of the norm against anti-personnel landmines in Eastern Europe. And I think this is, motivated by fear and security concerns. But we've really gone back in time in the discussion about military utility of anti-personnel landmines to be rehashing discussions we've had back as far as the early to mid 1990s. And I think there's sort of two overarching larger concerns that we're seeing here. One is, excuse me, the lack of accountability. And I see that sort of stemming from as far back as the Syrian civil war, where the use of landmines, use of cluster munitions, use of barrel bombs, bombing civilian infrastructure, cities and towns was widespread, and the international community probably did not step up as much as it should have. And then the part I'm really concerned about, and I'll wrap up this so that I can breathe again in a second here, is that there's different responses to these violations and erosion of the norms based on who is doing them. So allied states violating the humanitarian disarmament norms does not receive the same level of outrage and pressure as, enemy states or states that are more of a pariah state. And that double standard weakens the norm. If these norms are not applied to anyone under any circumstances, they become weaker, and the world is seeing that, what is good for us is not necessarily the same for them, or what is good for this group is not acceptable in others. And these double standards and hypocrisy are a major challenge. I'll leave it there because I know Susie has some of the better news. It's not all doom and gloom, and I will talk about that more going forward, but we'll start with a little bit of a downer. Thanks, Rose.
Thanks a lot, Erin, and for giving your perspective from working mainly on cluster munitions and landmines and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So some backtracking there to sum up with two main themes: the lack of accountability and the double standards or the politicization of norms. Susie, I would be interested. You work on nuclear weapons mainly, but you also work a lot with the industry and financial sector. How would you describe the trends and how does that impact your work within the humanitarian disarmament?
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Jeff, for organizing, Rose, Aaron, and Hinawai. It's great to be here with you all to talk about this very important issue as we're entering quite a significant year. I mean, 2025 is a milestone year, not solely for kind of the fives are always magical in some ways, but also this is the year that we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. And Aaron talked about going back in time. And so I've been thinking a lot about time these days and how, 80 years ago, the world was emerging from horror and conflict. And so put into place the framework for a system of agreements, discussions, and a way to prevent the scourge of war from happening again. So when we think about going back in time, there are different moments that we can go back to. Working on nuclear weapons issues, we're also going back in time to a new nuclear arms race. We haven't seen numbers going up the way they are now in decades. And that's not a good thing. So to add to the doom and gloom picture, on the other side of that, just a second, we're also seeing, and as Aaron talked about this, so I don't want to repeat Aaron because she's quite eloquent, generally more so than I am. But we're seeing a story of constantly bombarded with a story of, in a graphic, detailed, and devastating way of conflict, of war. And Aaron mentioned a number of these conflicts. And we're being sold a story that to deal with this, we need more weapons. That we need weapons for human rights defense. We need weapons for protection. And when it's immediate happening in your neighborhood, when the building next door to you has just been bombed, that is a very logical human response. Oh my gosh, don't let it happen again. But those who are selling us this story are selling this story as a way to kind of encourage investment and building up an industry of weapons and claiming that that industry of weapons is necessary to counter this kind of geostrategic instability, that industry is the answer, when we know, going back in time, that it's not the answer. We know from our history, from our experience, and honestly, we know from the majority of governments in the world that this is not the way to go, that this is not the way they want to go. And when defense ministers, as they have been doing across Europe, call for investment in the arms sector, what they're actually calling for is for a select few to make a profit, because that's why you invest, is to make a profit at the expense of the many, because you don't get to see that same level of return on investment when you put your money into building norms against conflict, when you put your money into development, when you put your money, it takes a different picture, that return on investment. And I think that it's really important for us to look and consider how this call for a revitalization of the arms sector is throwing out quite a few of the things that are global norms and treaties around human rights, but also around good business practice, have developed over decades. And I do spend a lot of time thinking about industry and talking with industry, talking with the sector. When you make an investment in a company, when you finance them, you want to make sure they are not corrupt. You want to make sure they have good management practices, that they deliver what they promise they're going to deliver, and that they're predictable in what they say their costs are. That is not the case when it comes to the arms sector. So there is also a double standard here, and Aaron mentioned double standards in terms of states, but we also start to see double standards in terms of industry and in terms of governance and business practice. You cannot, and we would never allow that kind of double standard to take place, for example, on pharmaceuticals. Heavily regulated, we don't want to just let Philip Lilly slide, let Moderna slide on some practices and some testing because they're quick in response. We haven't. We have a very recent experience of not letting them slide. we keep our standards in place. And I think that some states are working very hard to reject double standards, to keep those practices in place. Because when you look at the numbers, and I did a quick look at the recent UN General Assembly voting patterns on some of our humanitarian disarmament related resolutions, and I saw our numbers are up, which is very different than the story I see on my phone. Our numbers are up across, like, quite widely. We have more support on, more states supporting the resolution on the Landmines Convention, more states supporting resolutions on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, more states supporting the resolution around the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons than we have seen before. So there's a couple of stories happening here, and it's very common and easy to fall into the pattern of the world is getting bad, because that's what we are seeing constantly. But we also have to remember that there is quite a lot that is happening within our world, that things are trying to keep those standards high, keep our norms strong. There are friends calling out their allies. They're not as loud as we want them to be. They're not as bold as we want them to be. And I think that comes to us too, that we also have to constantly be empowered and emboldened to call out problems, to call out these double standards, to call out those who have an incentive to keep us afraid and working on answers that are short-term thinking as opposed to the longer-term thinking. So, I started off talking about we're going back in time, but we also have to look ahead. And I think I'll leave it there before I go way too far over my own time. And I'm sure I'll have a chance to come back. Thanks, Rose.
Oh, thanks a lot, Susie. I think that's very insightful, and it's good to remind ourselves that there have been different times for worse also, right? And that there are friends out there, and that we, it's especially in times when norms are challenged, we should stay very principled and strong about these norms. If I may turn to you. You work mainly on the Arms Trade Treaty, and Susie has just, painted the picture of a recalled or revitalization of the weapons industry in some parts of the world, at least. You work on the Arms Trade Treaty. Do you recognize these trends? And could you tell us a little bit more about that? How that impacts the discussions and the work that's being done under the Arms Trade Treaty?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rose. And I'm delighted to be joining Jeff, Erin, and Susie here. The Economist, in its outlook for 2025, included an article titled "Farewell to Arms Control." And, certainly the outlook for arms control, let alone humanitarian disarmament, is far from promising. As Susie has, set out, states are focused on building up and strengthening their military capacity, and in particular, these are Western states that I'm talking about, and this is demonstrated in the number of arms companies which are currently ramping up production in order to meet the growing demand. So I'm going to talk about, how this and the economic drivers, what impact they are having on the arms trade and some of the bigger trends within the arms trade at this moment. Just to add a further point about the ramping up of arms production that we're witnessing right now, when one day the current conflicts do abate and are resolved, it will be a challenge to rein in the increased capacity of the arms industry. And this is something that we have to keep in mind over the longer term. Now, turning to the Arms Trade Treaty, the treaty which regulates the international trade in conventional weapons. This is a treaty that does impact directly on states' geopolitical and economic interests. in that it requires states to pull back on arms transfers where these would facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law or human rights. We see this playing out at the ATT with a number of exporting states that continue to talk in very general terms about their decision-making processes on arms transfers. However, with the rulings of the International Court of Justice and the Human Rights Council mandating reports on specific country contexts and those addressing arms transfers, along with the ongoing efforts of NGOs to contest arms transfer decisions in national courts, there will be increasing pressure on states to explain and clarify how they have interpreted and applied the ATT's provisions. Last year, one of the major events for the ATT was the 10-year anniversary of the entry into force of the treaty. And it was only last year that there was the first formal discussion under the ATT on a case of compliance. And this concerned arms transfers to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Despite this discussion, the environment remains difficult and state representatives continue to question the role of discussions on compliance. What is important to focus on is that the credibility of any forum, especially multilateral forum, is enhanced when its member states are willing to address the difficult issues, particularly those that are both legally and politically sensitive. Multilateral discussions should be grounded in real-world cases and reflect how states have responded to those situations. Now, I just then briefly mentioned the fact that, under the ATT, there have been cases of national litigation taken which have been based on the ATT's obligations. And this is a unique feature of this treaty. That it has been used to challenge the government's decisions to transfer weapons to countries where there are serious violations of international law. And I want to raise a case that, I want to talk about a case that where the final judgment is soon to come out. And this concerns the Dutch case on parts and components. And all weapons systems are made up of parts and components. It is the ongoing supply of parts and components that enable bombing campaigns to be carried out on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So this shouldn't be left as only a technical issue. It is very much a key issue, especially in the arms trade. There are strong economic drivers as to why states want to continue supplying parts and components. And one of the reasons is that increasingly weapons are being jointly produced by groups or consortia of states. And one of these joint production programs that has been in the headlines is the US program on the production of F-35 jets. This is really what is at the heart of the Dutch case. And that's about the supply of parts and components to the F-35 program, which are then transferred on to Israel. This case demonstrates that the obligations of the ATT are justiciable. It also shows the different ways in which NGOs can support action, and no doubt NGOs will continue to take these cases of litigation and to explore new options for taking litigation in the future and how to challenge the decisions that are being taken by governments. So, this is just but one example, which I think, challenges the Economist and its headline in its article. And that, while we are in very challenging times, and that there is much to despair. It is in these moments of crisis that the objectives and obligations of international law can be realised and that progress can be made. So I refuse to go along with the views of the economists, but to say that, you know, through continuing to work together, through challenging the current trends, we can make progress. So back over to you, Ruth.
Thanks a lot, Hinamai. I think that's an excellent example of, you know, how national court cases can also enhance the lack of accountability that Erin was mentioning before. And obviously there are some cross-cutting issues here across the board, and I would like to pick up maybe on this one specifically. Moving from the lack of accountability maybe to the importance of the interpretation of these standards, as well as the implementation of these treaties and political declarations, and maybe also to look ahead a little bit towards the next year to see how we as a community can also support and enhance the implementation, as well as maybe also political accountability to actually not stop with ratifying a treaty, but also to implement it. Erin, if I may start with you to chip in on this.
Sure. Thanks, Rose. Yeah, I think the next year is going to be really important for the humanitarian disarmament movement in how we respond to these challenges through the implementation of these treaties. So the treaties I work on, the Mine Ban Treaty, the CCM, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, sorry, and even I think I'll leave the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to Susie. They all include provisions about universalizing the norms in the treaties and sharing these norms with others. So this is a really key part of the work, is to do the positive obligations within the treaties, to clear land, to assist victims. And when we start to see that these treaties actually have an impact on people's lives, that's when we see stronger adherence and more focus on what needs to be done. So I think it's really important that we start to focus on doing what the treaties say we have to do, speaking up when the treaties say we have to speak up, and addressing the harm these weapons cause to people, documenting that harm, responding to it, and preventing it. So despite all these challenges, we know that humanitarian disarmament makes the world safer. It makes people's lives better. And that's what we need to stay focused on going forward. And I will just actually note that I've seen on the participant guide here, there's a number of youth campaigners here, and that energy is going to be really important. Most of the youth campaigners now grew up with these treaties. They never lived in a world where the use of landmines was acceptable. So they're really seeing these debates happen at the international level and just wondering what on earth has gone wrong with the people that are looking at these horrific weapons and saying, you know, maybe we do actually need them. But in the interest of time, we'll pick this up in the Q&A. Thanks. You're still muted.
Great. Thanks a lot, Erin. I was going to give the floor to Susie. Susie, could you also weigh in on the importance of interpretation of the international treaties that are there and the implementation, and also maybe look ahead a little bit on the what concrete actions and recommendations this may lead up to for 2025?
Absolutely. My video's stopped by our host, and I'm sure he'll put it back on when he gets a chance. And there we go. Hi, everybody. Yes, so looking at interpretation and implementation. I think it's really important for us to remember that the work of a treaty does not stop at ratification. Great, your country's on board, fantastic. Now the work is really there. Aaron talked about universalization, getting other states to join. And I think that is really important. It's really key. It builds up the norm. It builds up the power around the treaty, and it also builds up not power necessarily in the usual way of thinking about it. It's perception, and there is a lot of power within the perception around this and the perceived strength of a treaty. When states join a treaty, it looks strong. So I'm always a big fan of universalization, and we've got two more to hit the 100 mark on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So if you are from a state that is nearly there, we'd love to see you, including at the forthcoming third meeting of states parties in March. But I think that's one way towards implementation, and the interpretation, though, is also really, really key. So I want to talk about that a little bit as well. Most of the treaties that we talk about, they prohibit the manufacture, production, and development of weapons and weapon systems. And I was so glad that I brought up the concept of components, because I talk about nuclear weapons and nobody makes the whole bomb in one go. It's not like they roll off the factory line like in a cartoon. They make the components. And you've got, RTX that does the communication systems. You've got Northrop Grumman that does the missile casings. You've got Boeing that makes the missile itself with the propulsion system that's done by a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, right? You got major companies working on different pieces, and key components is really important. And when I think about interpretation of a treaty, I'm also thinking about making sure that that treaty has impact in non-traditional sectors. So traditionally, we think about treaties having impact in our diplomatic sector. We expect a treaty to have impact on military planning and operations, that there are limits and guardrails put on what is allowable by the militaries deployed through the social contract in our names. But I also see the full interpretation of treaties means that people should not assist with things like the production, manufacture, development, and deployment of weapons. And that also leads to making profits, or investing or financing those activities. When it comes to nuclear weapons production and nuclear weapons activities, one of the ways we've seen a number of states implement this treaty is by adopting and by promoting either guidelines or legislation that has restricted the investment of funds into the companies that I just mentioned that are involved in the production of the weapons. And that broad interpretation that does strike out to multiple sectors, I think is very important for all of us. There should be criminal acts connected to violating these treaties. It's not always the case, but it's something that can be done on national levels to strengthen this and to strengthen the norms around it. And I think that as we evolve into as we see conflicts evolve, as we ourselves see these treaties and these norms evolve, we have to make sure that the way that we understand and implement these treaties and implement the broad-based normative assumption, these are unacceptable weapons. They cannot ever be used or made or sold or bought or given to anybody else. They're just unacceptable. That has to trickle across many sectors. And I think sometimes it's in our interest that the language in some of these treaties is just a little bit vague. That leaves us the space to allow meetings of states parties, to allow the bodies that interpret the treaties on the basis of their shared understanding to give a pronouncement in that moment. This is what we see. This is how we understand it, and to allow that to change and evolve through time. I think that's really key. There's a lot of things that we can and we should and we want to do. And I think there are a growing number of actors who are interested in working with us to do so. And by looking at many ways to interpret and many ways to implement these instruments and the norms that they build up and they shore up, I think we give a space to do so. And I'll stop there because otherwise I will go way over time. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Susan. I think that's really insightful. Also, how the interpretation of a certain, standard, the prohibition on the assistance of production, has also led to an overspill of establishing these norms in a different sector. And I know you've been doing a lot of work to get this done within the financial sector, but I think that's a really interesting example on how we can expand and universalize the norms in that sense, not only with states, but also across different sectors, and also how we can find allies in different sectors than we might think of right away. This, I think, will be a good moment also to move towards recommendations a little bit to us, maybe as civil society, but also there's also diplomats in the audience. So I would also encourage you to make recommendations for states, but listening to you, we are operating in a challenging political landscape, but there's also positive developments happening at the same time. And I would like to ask each one of you to make recommendations for our sector more broadly, or specifically on the areas you work with, if you like. And I will start with Hinawai, if that's okay. Hinawai, are there any recommendations you would like to make in this event to move the agenda forwards on the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, or the Humanitarian Disarmament community more broadly?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's very important at this time that we, both states and NGOs really keep in mind the overall objectives of these treaties. Why were these treaties negotiated in the first place? And, why is it the treaties that prohibited indiscriminate weapons were negotiated? For the ATT, one of the key objectives was to prevent the human suffering caused by the irresponsible arms transfers. So these objectives really need to guide our actions. And, in the coming year, there's going to be much distraction, and we can expect to see in the headlines a strong focus on what the US and the Russian Federation are doing. But, still at this time, strong communities of practice can be built. And these can be built by states and international organizations and NGOs coming together to identify what is good practice and promoting that good practice. And in the ATT, that is by those states which have explained their decision-making processes around the arms transfer process and very clearly set out what are the clear markers that they will not cross when making the decision about transferring weapons. So, clarifying the interpretation of treaties, setting out clear markers. This is important at this time, and it is work that can carry on. It is important to focus on really the nuts and bolts of what makes these treaties work, and that is implementing legislation and reports that are submitted in support of transparency. It is this groundwork that goes towards strengthening international norms. We need to demonstrate, as Erin said very clearly, that humanitarian disarmament is working. And that, this is an important message for NGOs. It's not necessarily always about chasing down the latest or the trendiest issue. It is about taking a hard look at what is causing the most harm. One issue that remains very much unfinished business, and that is small arms and light weapons. It is fair to say that the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, it is struggling. It needs support. All states should have legislation on the ownership and control of small arms and light weapons. This is a difficult time for NGOs. There are, terrible funding funding pressures everywhere within the system. But, still, it is NGOs who need to call out sensitive and difficult issues, and that must include cases of non-compliance. And the last thing that I would say is that, much is going to be called into question in the coming years, especially multilateralism, and why should states continue to invest in these processes? It is important that multilateral processes don't get caught up in endless administrative discussions, but actually can demonstrate that they are having an impact on the ground, so that they are helping to progress both implementation and compliance. And so those are my recommendations. I look forward to the recommendations by Erin and Susie.
Thanks a lot, Hidewai. Without further ado, I will turn to Erin. And Erin, you've been talking about cluster munitions and landmines. Mainly, I would also like to ask you if you could say anything about the autonomous weapons debate, because that has been left out of the discussions on the day that the Austrian Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg has been appointed the 2024 Arms Control Person of the Year. So if you can, maybe you can also look ahead and recommend something on the autonomous weapon system debates. Thanks.
Yeah, Rose, you stole my fun announcement, but that's fine. Yeah, so I have 3 recommendations, one of which is really based on my experience working on the issue of autonomous weapons. And that is that we need to promote inclusive bodies to be making decisions and avoid bodies that operate under strict consensus rules. The ongoing discussions at the Convention on Conventional Weapons, group of governmental experts about autonomous weapons, are operating under a really strict interpretation of consensus rule that's giving any one state essentially veto. And this is preventing progress that's wanted by the majority of the states. So what we need to be looking at is options to move this conversation to a forum where a bad actor can't stymie progress that everybody wants and can't, throw out civil society and other observers from the room to prevent them from seeing their bad behavior. We need to be starting negotiations on autonomous weapons. Now, time is running out, and we can't be stuck in these non-inclusive, veto-ridden bodies. So in general, disarmament needs to be happening in inclusive decision-making bodies. And then my other 2 recommendations would be to speak up even when it is your friends violating the norms. That disarmament norms need to be equally applied to all states. And then finally, to echo a bit of what Hidewai said, we need to keep the focus on people. This work is about protecting people and communities, and that's what sets humanitarian disarmament apart from other approaches to peace and security. We're focused on reducing harm to the civilians and the environment, and we need to stay focused on that goal, despite all the chaos around us. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Susie, if I may turn to you.
Great. So there's so many things I could say because there's always too many things, but I'll also do my best and keep it to three key points. And looking ahead, I think we have to really undermine the incentives for weaponization. When there's no profit in building bombs, less bombs will be built, right? And so there's lots of ways to do that, to look at those, like to challenge the profit motives, to shame those who are seeking to make a profit, to make pictures of Jim Tacklet and Kathy Warden and put them on stickers and say, these guys suck because they took home millions last year of taxpayer money to make tools to kill, right? Like there's things that we can do. We should really undermine the incentive for weaponization and challenge those profit motives. Part of the way to do that, I mean, stickers aside, but part of the way to do that is to recognize that there are a lot more allies within our work than we usually think. And this is what I'm discovering as I engage more and more with the sustainable finance community. Oh my goodness, how many sustainable finance people have interned at CIPRI? It's ridiculous. And there are people who are with us and are looking for ways and means to be our allies, to give us support, to help protect humans, to strengthen human rights and humanitarian provisions, and who don't want to repeat mistakes of the past. Like I'm well aware that there have been a lot of mistakes made, and there has been a lot of ecological and human destruction, and there is a way to prevent that. They're eager to help. And finally, that's one sector, but we actually have to have a lot of public conversations too, because when we raise awareness, we raise the cost of contravening norms and agreements. Now, here's the thing, the devil is in the detail. With the technical agreements, there's a lot of nuance. And public conversations do not sustain nuance these days. But overwhelmingly, when polls are done, when folks like the folks at Human Security Lab do these public polls at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, public polls on opinions on the use of weapons or on these different norms, and overwhelmingly find humans do not want to indiscriminately harm other humans. It's just not okay with people. So we have this massive public support base that we can and should continue to tap into. And when we do, we make the political cost high. And we do not get those contraventions. We do not get those who challenge, who violate these agreements that we have put so much time and energy into building up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susie. And I will turn to the Q&A now. There is a function in which you can actually like certain questions. So I'm going to take the questions by popularity, I think. And quite high up is a question from Henrique Garbino about any reputational, political, financial, or legal consequences for Lithuania following its withdrawal from the CCM. And similarly, what are states doing or not to influence Finland's current debate to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention? And there has already been a reply by Jaakko Elisari that there will be a government report to the parliament about the issue later this month. The commander of the defense forces opened to discussion, asking whether Finland should leave Ottawa, seeing Russia's proceeding in Ukraine. He did not mention the US decision 3 days earlier to transfer anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine. I'm thinking, Aaron, if that this might be something that you would like to comment on?
Sure, yeah. Reputational consequences for Lithuania are still emerging. Sorry. States, to be honest, a lot of states were caught a little off guard by Finland's discussion in Finland starting, but we are seeing some allied states start to use bilateral conversations with Finland. Civil society, I think Finnish civil society has been speaking up as well. So we're working on progress there to influence them not to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention. It took a long time to get Finland in, but I know the ICRC, civil society, and states parties are all speaking with Finland now, and really focusing on going back to those basics about the arguments about military utility and how those are the humanitarian considerations outweigh any military utility that we're seeing.
Thanks a lot, Erin. And I think this also relates to Lizzie Humphrey's questions about the most effective arguments to counter the narratives of military utility of indiscriminate weapons like anti-personnel landmines. I think it's safe to in general say that these weapons were not banned because they lacked any military utility, but that the humanitarian problems resulting from those weapons outweighed their military utility, as Erin was also saying. Erin, maybe one specific question on this: has technological advancements impacted these arguments, both for and against anti-personnel landmines? Lizzie is wondering.
I think technological advancements people often think have impacted these arguments, but you'll hear a lot of conversations about smart mines that deactivate. And to be honest, most of that technology is actually from the 1990s. The smart mines that are being transferred to Ukraine from the US right now, when we were in the review conference, they were older than most of my youth campaigners participating in the diplomatic conference. So a lot of that advancement is not actually that advanced, but also smart mines are still indiscriminate. Then smart mines still are a bunch of explosives in the ground. So a lot of the humanitarian impact can still be there.
And then I see a question from Ali Shackleton that could be also answered by Susie and Hinawai. She asks, how much good can a treaty do if countries who have these weapons don't sign them? And she immediately thinks of the TPNW. None of the nuclear states signed it. Is there a way forward for these treaties without the biggest contributors and users signing? Susie, I could imagine you'd be eager to take this one.
Well, yes. Thanks, Ellie, for the good question. And it's something that we hear a lot. Oh, so, big actors are not on board. All these really rich countries, they're not there. So it doesn't matter because only countries that don't count are the only ones there. Well, number one, that's not the reality. Like, let's look at what countries are taking action under this treaty. Indonesia just joined the TPNW. There's some big actors in the room. Not only that, but since the TPNW went into force, not one, but two companies have stepped out of the production of nuclear weapons. Production, like efforts which were making them millions in multi-year contracts, but they stepped out. Why? Because they assessed and understood that the reputational risk of being associated with the production of a weapons system and of weapons that are prohibited under international law, despite the fact that they were being bought by countries that have had them for decades, is too much of a risk for them. So that is one, that's an area that I pay a lot of attention to. That's one impact. Another impact that we have seen is that we have a coalescence and a convergence of states that are actively and vociferously condemning threats to use nuclear weapons. Again, this is a treaty I'm most familiar with, as we saw made implicitly and overtly since the start of the Ukraine war. And never has that happened in such a coordinated and comprehensive and strong way, to the point that those threats, every time they've been made, condemnation happens, those threats have been subsequently walked back. Those threats are prohibited under the treaty. So the treaty has an effect. And honestly, I do not think that states would be so actively lobbying against anybody going near the treaty if they weren't scared of how powerful that treaty is. And we have seen the efforts of some states who have nuclear arms or who are pro-nuclear weapon states really working hard to say, don't go near it, don't go near it, don't go to that side, stay with us, stay with us. They're in the minority and they're on the wrong side of history. So I think there is a lot these treaties can do, and a lot of places that they have effect, even before those larger actors are on board. And we've seen it before with other treaties, the impact that they have had, but there's others here who can speak to that much more eloquently than I.
Thanks a lot, Susie. Unfortunately, time is not on our side for this particular webinar. With 2 minutes left on the clock, I am going to turn to one last question, which is by Wanda Munoz. And I'm going to ask the panelists if they have any thoughts on this to be sweet and precise in their answers. Short, basically. She asks, how do we think that we can encourage others to engage and keep working to implement and advance IHL when we are all seeing acts of genocide in Gaza and have little power for some or no political will for others to stop it? So basically, how can we inspire others to stick to IHL and even advance IHL while at the same time we see these horrors happening? Who can I give the floor to? Hinawai?
Yeah, although this is really terrible what we are witnessing. Action is still happening. It was significant that the ICC issued arrest warrants for those at the top of the chain of command for what is happening in Gaza. This was really a significant development in international criminal law, and it does demonstrate that there are institutions that will continue to pursue accountability. We also see the Human Rights Council in different country-specific reports has been mandated to track down issues of who is transferring not only weapons but parts and components and ammunition. And there will be interesting reports this year on the occupied Palestinian territories and on Myanmar. So it is terrible, but it's not a case of total despair. Also, there have been trade unions in different ports that have refused to cooperate with shipping companies that are transferring weapons on to different contexts where genocide is at risk. And so, we need to continue to innovate, to raise these issues and to find new ways of pursuing these issues. And, we need to keep a very clear record of what has happened and who has been involved. And, I continue to believe that one day accountability will be possible.
Thanks a lot, Hinawai. Erin and Susie, any final words?
I would just add that if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? If we're moved to work on these issues, there are others who are also moved to work on these issues. We find each other, we continue to do that because it is up to us to hold the line. And if we can't fix it today, the very least we can do is to make sure that there's a tomorrow for others to keep working on it.
Well, Susie said that quite well. I'll just, I guess, close with we can't afford not to speak up. Even if we don't feel like we're being heard, we can't afford to not speak up. Thanks.
That's right. Thanks a lot for those finishing words. I mean, we can't afford it not to push back, not to defend the norms that were set, and also not to continue to set an advanced agenda for humanitarian disarmament because the consequences would just be too big. I would like to thank you all from the audience for asking the questions. I would like to ask the panelists for giving their thoughts today, and I would like to thank Jeff and the Forum on Arms Trade for organizing this event. The amount of questions that are still unanswered really show that there was a big demand for conversations like this to take place. And I would just like to tell everybody that follow-up resources will be shared by email and online soon. I could imagine that if there are certain questions that you would like to address to one of our speakers, that you can find them on the website of the forum on arms trade, and I could also imagine that we can share their email addresses for following up. Lastly, but not least, a survey will pop up when you exit this webinar. And I would like to kindly ask you to fill this in. I've been told it's not a very lengthy process, so if you could, fill the survey in, that would be greatly appreciated. With this, I would like to end the call and thank you all once again for joining us today. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.